Good evening. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening because I'm very enthusiastic to share with you many of my experiences with the Irish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Irish CND, over many decades. Irish CND, as we now know it, really dates back to October 1979, but I had been involved in peace protests and non-violent direct action for some time before that. Rob and I would have worked on Dawn magazine. I was involved with the campaign against the arms trade in the 1970s, although that was quite unsuccessful. I organised a protest outside the British Embassy when the police were called, but there were only 3 protesters there, so there was no Garda action needed. That was a lesson in how not to organise direct action. I was also involved in the Cairnsore Point sit-ins and was involved in leading some of the workshops there in the 1970s. And then in 1978, I brought together a number of peace groups, I suppose about a dozen or 2 dozen peace groups, to put together a submission to the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in advance of the second special session of the United Nations General Assembly on disarmament. And that special session was probably a key moment in generating a lot of interest in Ireland, or reviving a lot of interest at that stage in nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament and Irish government foreign policy. Little did I realise that a year later, in 1979, I was going to spend a full term in Japan on a fellowship that I had been offered. And during that time I visited, I was based in Tokyo, but I visited Hiroshima and met a number of the Hibakusha survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And speaking to them, I asked them what was the one thing they wanted me to do when I went back to Ireland. And they said, please tell them about what has happened. Please tell them so that this should never happen again. So I contacted the CND offices in London immediately when I came back and found out that there were only 6 paid up members of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Ireland. And that August I spoke at a workshop at the sit-in at Cairnsore at the proposed nuclear power station site in South County Wexford. And I was shocked to realise that very few people realised the implications of a nuclear power station of that type in Ireland at the time, because it would be producing weapons-grade material, weapons-grade uranium, and to a smaller degree weapons-grade plutonium that could be recycled as the byproduct of a nuclear reactor of that sort. So in 1979, I called together the 6 paid-up members of CND in Ireland and asked them what they thought we could do. And some of them had experience from being at the Aldermaston marches in the 1950s and the 1960s, but they weren't a very energetic group of people. But nevertheless, we decided to go ahead and reorganise Irish CND in Ireland. It was fortuitous timing, because within a few months, the West had decided to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles on continental Europe, and the Soviet Union had decided to deploy SS-20 missiles on continental Europe. And this caused a major public reaction right throughout Europe, and we were ready to organise. The protests were phenomenal. People took to the streets against the whole nuclear policy that was that was in a state of evolution throughout the West and the East at the time. And Irish CND grew and grew and grew in a way that I had never imagined it would. So that by 1980, 1981, I was spending many an evening every week just sleeping on other people's floorboards and in their front rooms as I was involved in travelling around Ireland trying to organise CND on the ground. Branches grew up. At one stage, we decided to show the film The War Game, Peter Watkins' 1966 movie that had been dropped by the BBC after they had commissioned it. And we packed out one of the largest rooms in Liberty Hall. There were people outside the doors who couldn't get in. So it was a movement that had come at the right time. And we also found that we were there at the right time because there were two major visits by Ronald Reagan and Vice President Bush, as he was at the time, to Ireland. The briefcases coming was the slogan that we used for some of those visits. And an amusing story out of all of this. At one stage, we had a meeting in Cork to organise protests and to coordinate with other protests that were being organised during the Ronald Reagan visit. And on the way back, a large number of us stopped in the Ronald Reagan Inn, which had just been renamed in Ballyporeen in County Tipperary, and spent an hour or two in the bar playing at the pool table. And the proprietor got very upset and got very worried and called the guards because he thought here was a protest group who were casing his joint and ready to organise protests and to get into his bar. During the Reagan visits and during the Bush visits, I remember many a night sleeping on the crush barriers that had been put up outside the American embassy. At one stage, following people who had their CIA pin on their lapel, following them through the streets, and it must have been very embarrassing for those poor, untrained people as they came up against what we now regarded ourselves as being seasoned protesters. And CND grew spontaneously in the early 1980s, so that we had trade union CND, women's CND, Christian CND, student CND, branches growing up in every major town and city throughout Ireland, and also in all of the university campuses. One of the groups that was particularly active were the women's group who did not necessarily use the name CND. And a group of women went to Greenham Common, and over the weekend, with an Irish flag and an Irish CND banner and a women's CND banner, stood on the silos at Greenham Common to protest against the proposed deployment of cruise missiles on Greenham Common. Their photograph appeared on the front page of the London Times the next day, and one particular activist in Irish CND was very embarrassed and wanted to know how these women were going to respond to the perception of this photograph in the Times, that it would bring down on all of us the hang 'em and flog 'em brigade in the Tory party who wanted to be anti-Irish at every opportunity. Of course, good feminists, good women, they were not going to be controlled by a man like that, and they were successful. I mean, the Greenham Common protest is an example of how nonviolent direct action actually works. Greenham Common has been returned to being common land, to being open land, and there are no cruise missiles there today. I suppose we've also succeeded in terms of Irish foreign policy on nuclear disarmament. It is exactly where I would have wanted it to have been when that first meeting of 6 Irish CND members was called in the Quaker Meeting House in Dublin in October 1979. I think there are times for movements like this, and the time for Irish CND may come around again. But I'm very glad that we have an example to show in how nonviolent direct action works with our protests against Reagan and Bush, against cruise and Pershing missiles, against the SS-20 missiles, against Greenham Common, the way we mobilised churches, students, trade unions, local activists. We have a lesson to learn from how Irish CND worked in organising people in great numbers for non-violent direct action against nuclear weapons. once again, I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening.